Okay, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jeffy Goldwasser. I'm the director of the Simons Institute for Theory of Computing. And for all of you who don't know it, it's an international venue for collaborative research in theoretical computer science. Is reaching out also to the sciences and other fields of computer science. It was established in 2012 with a generous grant from the Simons Foundation. We come together here, senior scientists, junior scientists, the future generation, to do research and discuss topic of interest. And today it's really my great pleasure to introduce a very distinguished panel and an event. It's part of our Theoretically Speaking public lecture series. We are going to be talking about the movie Coded Bias, which premiered in 2002 Sundance Film Festival, 2020, sorry. So it's very recent. And the film, perhaps many of you have seen it. Those who haven't, it's streaming on Netflix right now, and I highly recommend it. My guess is that after this panel, you definitely will go and see it if you haven't seen it yet. What the film does, it explores the impact of machine learning algorithms on all parts of our life, on society, on systematic issues of algorithmic bias and the impact it can have on our lives today and in the future. And I'm extremely fortunate that we're going to have this panel to discuss it. Simons Institute has been active in this area to the extent, to some extent so far. We have had several clusters on algorithmic fairness, and some of you have been part of them in previous summers. And this is also part of a larger initiative on algorithms, society, and the law. And some of you have been also in a previous workshop that we had at Simons on Wrong at the Root a few years ago. So I'm delighted to host this panel. I'm really delighted that you all agreed to come and join us, and especially like to introduce our going to be fearless leader, Aisha Wilson, who's going to moderate the panel. And Aisha is an assistant professor of electrical engineering and computer science at MIT. She's a member of the faculty of the AI and decision-making part of computer science. And she has a BA from Harvard and a PhD from Berkeley in statistics. So I'm especially even more happy to host you in Berkeley again, even if it's virtual. And her research focuses on things very related to the theme of this panel, on methodological foundations and theory of various topics in machine learning. So please welcome Aisha, and I'm going to give you the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shafi, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to have such a great panel here. I guess we'll start by discussing a little bit with Shalini Kantayya, the director who is here, about the film, and then we'll bring in our other panelists to discuss in an open forum our thoughts and feelings about the film. So without further ado, I'm just going to introduce Shalini. So as Shafi mentioned, she's the director of Coded Bias, which debuted at the Sundance Film Festival in 2020. She also had her debut Catching the Sun, which premiered at the LA Film Festival and was named a New York Times Critics' Pick. She's a TED Fellow, a Fulbright Scholar, and an associate of the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. So just super impressive, and so happy to have her here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm just so excited to ask you questions. I think one of the first things that stood out to me was the diversity of examples in the film. You had examples of algorithmic bias spanning education, healthcare, risk assessment tools. I was just wondering about how you came to these examples, what led you to them.
Well, thank you again. And I'm so excited to be in conversation with this astute panel. I just want to say that, 3 years ago when I started making this film, I didn't even know what an algorithm was. I think my street cred in the game is that I'm a sci-fi fanatic, and everything that I had known about artificial intelligence had come through the imagination of Steven Spielberg or Stanley Kubrick. I'm definitely someone who's watched Blade Runner way too many times. And I don't think that my background as a sci-fi fanatic, which I think is how most of the public understands artificial intelligence, had really prepared me for the ways in which AI has is being used in the now. And I stumbled down the rabbit hole when I read a book called Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neil. And I was completely kind of shocked to learn the ways in which algorithms, machine learning, AI is increasingly becoming this gatekeeper of opportunity, oftentimes an invisible gatekeeper of opportunity, and deciding really important things like who gets hired, who gets what quality of health care, even how long a prison sentence someone may serve. And I think at the same time, as I was sort of grappling with the way in which human beings are outsourcing our decision-making and our autonomy to machines in ways that I think change lives and shape human destinies, I came across a talk that Joy Bellamwini gave, and was startled to understand that these same systems that we are putting our blind faith in to make so many important decisions have not been vetted for racial bias or for gender bias, or in many cases, more broadly, they haven't been vetted to make sure they won't hurt people, that they won't cause harm. And I was very shocked to understand that in many cases, they haven't even been vetted for some shared standard of accuracy outside of the companies that stand to benefit economically from their deployment. And that's when I really began to understand that everything I love and value as a free person living in a democracy, access to fair and accurate information, free and fair elections, the fair equal opportunity and employment, the fact that women or LGBTQ people or people of color shouldn't be discriminated against in the workplace, that communities of color shouldn't have undue police scrutiny, that all of the things that I value and hold dear are rapidly being transformed by algorithms and by AI. And that's when I really began to understand quite what Joy Bellamwini articulates so clearly in the film, which is that we could essentially roll back 50 years of civil rights advances in the name of trusting these systems to be fair, to be unbiased, and to be just when in many cases they're not.
Yeah, you mentioned those impacted. I think one of the things your film does so powerfully is actually center people who are actually impacted. You had you had Daniel Santos, the teacher in Houston, and Tanya Lemires, who was affected by a risk assessment tool. How did you find these people who were impacted?
Well, I'm really grateful. I mean, I think that coded bias, I think that the challenge of making it was really twofold. One was to disseminate really complex science in a way that your grandma understands and your 12-year-old understands, but also has some integrity still in the science. And I think when it comes to AI, all of the knowledge has been in the hands of the few. So all of the power has been in the hands of the few. So I think part of it was the challenge of taking someone's PhD dissertation and trying to translate it into 2 minutes that somehow was cinematic and visual and hopefully entertaining in some way. But I think the other challenge of the film was really exactly what you said, which is to put a human face, to really connect to the communities that have skin in the game, that really have something at stake with these systems. And I think so often, I think Eli Pariser was tweeting and he said, like, I've been to a lot of conferences on the history of technology, but not on the the future of humanity, the future of technology, but not the future of humanity. And I think so many times that we talk about tech, we talk about it in a way that certainly doesn't include people, but also isn't about people, isn't human-centered. And one of the challenges I had in making the film was just how opaque these systems of power are. And it's so hard for someone to even know they've been discriminated against, that there was an algorithm involved in that system. And for me, it was also really important to show autonomy and agency, and the fact that everyday people without degrees from Berkeley or MIT or Stanford can still fight back against these technological systems. And, and I've seen that time and time again. I always say that, documentaries remind me that everyday people can make a difference. And I saw that in the stories of Daniel Santos, who, you could stand 10 feet away from this man and know that what a great teacher he is. And yet an algorithm that was designed, first of all, to judge fertility in bulls somehow gets used to judge whether a teacher is a good teacher. I kid you not, that was the origin of that algorithm. And then, and it's only through that process, and we trust it like big magic. Oh, he's got a red mark on his record. He is a bad teacher. He needs discipline. And we treat it like it is, Kathy O'Neill says, it's data science, so we should treat it like a science. We shouldn't treat it like a faith-based religion. But we're putting our faith in these systems in this godlike way of saying, oh, he has a bad mark, and not looking at the values encoded in those systems. Like, can we even have an algorithm that judges whether a teacher is a good teacher? What are we saying here? Are we saying like, okay, the kid's improvement of scores, that's all that goes into making a good teacher? And a teacher like Daniel Santos, who teaches kids that aren't privileged, where 80% of those kids are coming in as English as a second language, and he's being penalized for the kids being not privileged and not performing well in this scoring system. And the way in which that becomes a form of power that he cannot question, it's a black box. And the way that he was able to fight against it and say, this violated my due process. If you fire me, you have to tell me why. If you discipline me, you have to tell me why. And the fact that even the people who invent these systems don't totally understand how they work or arrived at that system makes this new kind of opaque power that cannot be questioned. And that's why I'm so heartened by people like him and like Trenae Moran of Brooklyn, who didn't even know what biometric data was. Just a third generation Brooklynite living in that building. The landlord says, you have to opt out, not even we need your consent, but you have to opt out. We're going to put this in a building which is already high surveillance. And not only did Trenae Moran and Aisha May Downs educate their community and their neighbors and keep their landlord from installing this kind of racially biased invasive surveillance technology in the place they live, but they inspired the first legislation in the state of New York that would inspire other residents to do that would prevent other residents from having to deal with that same kind of surveillance. And to me, that is the power of literacy. And it's my hope that Coded Bias, pulls up a chair for all of us and says we all have a place at the table because these technologies are deployed on all of us in how these technologies are designed and deployed, and really in the fight for more ethical and less biased technologies that define our future.
Yeah, that's such an important point about how so much can be lost when you move to make it measurable and how that can impact people. That's great. Another thing along the lines of directorial choices, the last kind of question along these lines is, while joy was a common thread throughout the film, your film centered a lot of voices. We had a lot of lawyers, authors, civil rights attorneys, a variety of women and people of color who are in the tech space, and I think even an apartheid historian. And I think what was noticeably absent was there weren't gatekeepers who were featured or people who were necessarily hands-on developing the algorithms. So I just wanted to understand, which I loved, I just wanted to get a sense for what perspectives you chose to include and why.
Well, I'm so grateful. I just want to say thank you for noticing that. I think that this is the beauty and joy of making a truly independent film with a bold artistic voice, because I don't think Coded Bias could have been made in a commercial framework. I think that they would have called for me to have those gatekeepers in the film. And I think as far as centering voices of people of color and women, I think we look at technology films that have the exact same gender ratios, but they're all mostly predominantly men. And we don't even bat an eyelash. We're so used to seeing men talk about the technologies, and mostly white men talk about the technologies that will define the future. And honestly, I didn't set out to tell a film that was predominantly women and people of color, although I am someone who thinks very conscientiously about whose voices I'm amplifying and representing. I do think a lot about representation. But it was actually the research that kept bringing me back to these voices. And I remember sitting in the edit room one day and being like, wow, it's all women. How did that happen? Does that mean it's a woman's film? And I decided, no, it's not a woman's film. It's just a film. And what I came to realize is that I feel that Coded Bias is actually representative of the demographic that has been fighting against bias and for greater ethics in artificial intelligence for 20 years.
Yeah.
And what is common, I think, to the cast of the film is not only are they some of the smartest human beings that I've ever interviewed, advanced degrees in data science and mathematics from MIT and Harvard and every astute elite institution in the country. But they also had an experience of being marginalized. They also had an identity that was marginalized. They were women, they were people of color, they were LGBTQ, they were religious minorities. And I think that misfits of all sorts. And I think that having an experience that was marginalized allowed them to bring more of their humanity into the room and shine a light into some of the blind spots that Silicon Valley may have missed. And I think that that is a powerful thing. I mean, when I consider for the fact that 3 Black women graduate students, Joy Belamwini, Dr. Timnit Gebru, and Deborah Raji, found racial bias in commercially available facial recognition technology that was already being sold to the FBI, already being sold to ICE, already being sold to law enforcement, and somehow that Microsoft, IBM, and Amazon missed. I think that's a rally cry for more voices at the table. And I think one of the things that I have become compassionate for is our own predicament as human beings, and that bias is not something that's in white men, and it's not in a few bad law enforcement officers, but that bias is an innate human condition that we all have, and in many times is unconscious to us. And that means that we have to be hyper vigilant, perpetually vigilant about controlling for AI in the systems that we're designing. And I think that means that building inclusive teams is not just good for the pictures or good for the communities that have been historically discriminated against, but actually absolutely essential in making innovative technologies that are deployed on the world. And I think that that is really important. And the last thing I just want to say is, I think that we've had sort of a stunning lack of imagination about how these technologies have been used and can be used, because we've had such a homogeneous elite group of people in the rooms where the design is happening. And it's my hope that coded bias sort of centers a new group of voices, and somehow unleashes a new kind of imagination around how we can use these technologies in the future.
Yeah, I definitely think your film is definitely a stepping stone to getting there. So appreciate that. Your film starts with an example of error, accuracy problems, but then it definitely weaves in greater issues of power, governance, and accountability, surveillance. And I would say it interleaves between these topics throughout the movie through examples and just people kind of speaking truth to power. And I was just wondering what was your decision process for how to lay out these various topics and concerns with AI?
Well, I call it the dark night of the soul in a documentary, because it's sort of, you have to kind of go down the rabbit hole. And I often joke, like, there were parties happening because it was pre-COVID when I made the film, and I was too afraid to go to parties because I was scared someone would ask me what I was working on and I couldn't describe it. I'd be like, I'm making a film about racist robots. That was actually the working title of the film. And it was really, as someone who doesn't have a background in data science or artificial intelligence, it was incredibly, I was very humbled and incredibly overwhelmed, I would say, with what I was discovering, because it was such a steep learning curve for me. Mm-hmm. And it took a long time just to digest the science communication. And if it's clearly laid out in the film, it was through a lot of long, late nights trying to figure out, does this make sense? Mm-hmm. If I cut away, is that making sense? And then, a testing process. And I think the two things were putting the ideas and then connecting you to the stakes of why it matters. Because I think the beauty of a film versus a paper, a cited paper of some sort, is the emotional story. And the reason I am a filmmaker is I think filmmaking is an extension of my engagement with the world. Mm-hmm. And it is my belief that we don't act not because we don't. There's actually a Brecht quote, Bertolt Brecht says, we don't act not because we don't know what lies beyond the prison gate, the factory wall. We do not act because we don't feel. Mm-hmm. And I think that when we speak about these technologies, they're often talked about in a way that lacks humanity, that lacks feeling, that lacks emotion. And one of the things the film really seeks to do is create empathy for the people who could be harmed by these technologies. And it's my sort of theory of change that empathy, the thing that actually machines don't have, empathy is actually that seed that sparks social change. And Roger Ebert called films empathy machines. And so to me, the structure of the film is very much surrounded in sort of the arc of it is the human stories, is the human narratives and the human stakes. And that's how I tried to frame the film.
Really, it comes through. Actually, one of the wrapping up questions I wanted to ask was the ending of the film was, I thought, remarkably powerful. And it featured an example given by Zeynep Tufekci about Dominic Petrov and his decision to not launch a missile. And I think that the kind of wrapping message is that, an AI system being fully efficient is not the most human, I think is the quote that she gave, which, was very powerful. And then your film ends with kind of cataloging progress in terms of regulation. And so I just wanted to ask about that choice to end on on these notes of regulation and the human component.
Well, I think that, I struggled with whether to include that because it almost feels like an epilogue to Joy's arc of the film. But I love that story. And I think we were very creative about how we created the Soviet Union in that era. And I think that why that was so important was how much can be at stake.
Yeah.
When you have the life and death literally of an entire nation at the whim of a system that doesn't have morals, doesn't have ethics, doesn't have compassion, doesn't have empathy, and yet somehow we call these systems intelligent. That seems like a failed sort of vocabulary failure there, that you call something intelligent that doesn't have empathy or morals or ethics. And so to me, that last moment is kind of the stakes of the entire film, that this is life and death. And in the making of the film, I really saw everything, livelihood, civil rights, our people's freedoms being governed by these technological systems. And so to me, it was this last button of this is what's at stakes. And then the other thing was sort of the voice of the AI, which is throughout the film, beginning and ending the film. And it was a tricky kind of thing because actually the first half of it is actually documentary transcript from this chatbot. And I had to do a bleeped version for high school students. And I joke that all of the foul language is from the chatbot. And so, you see this Tay chatbot that goes bad. And then there's a moment where it sort of morphs into the more Siri woman's voice of the actor. And that's narration that I wrote. And that is sort of this hypothetical, this is who I'm becoming, and ending the film with, this question of what form I will be, and leaving that up to kind of governance. And to me, it really was this question of, perpetually, it was this question of the form it will take, and that being really about our governance. And to me, it's my real belief that, I'm so grateful to be having conversations like this one, because this moment feels very pivotal to me. And I feel that we really have a moonshot moment where the cement is still wet and we can sort of let our voices be heard and shape this technology with our democratic values. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping for in the film. It's sort of this open-ended, this is our moonshot, this is our moment, where will we go next?
Fantastic. I think this is a great opportunity to loop in some experts who are also thinking about these questions from different perspectives, and to get their thoughts on the film and their perspectives on fairness in AI. So please stick around, and I'm gonna introduce several of our other panelists. First up, we have the wonderful Seny Kamara. Hi, Seny. Seny is a professor of computer science at Brown University and chief science at Aroki Systems. Before joining Brown, he was a researcher at Microsoft Research in Redmond. His research is in cryptography and is driven by real-world problems from privacy, security, and surveillance. At Brown, Kamara co-directs the Encrypted Systems Lab and is affiliated with the CAPS Group, the Data Science Initiative, the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies, and the Policy Lab. He teaches the course Algorithms for the People that surveys, critiques, and aspires to address the ways in which computer science and technology affect marginalized communities. Very impressive. Welcome, Seny. Happy to have you here. Next up, we have Sendhil Mullainathan. Sorry, Sendhil. He is super impressive. Roman Family University Professor of Computation and Behavioral Science at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. His current research uses machine learning to understand complex problems in human behavior, social policy, and especially medicine, where computational techniques with the potential to uncover biomedical insights from large-scale health data. He's won numerous awards, of which I'll just mention he's the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant and he's designated a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, was labeled a top 100 global thinker of Foreign Policy magazine, and was named the smart list of 50 people who will change the world. Welcome so much, Sendhil. Next up, we have Omar Reingold. He is the Rajiv Motwani Professor of Computer Science at Stanford University and the Director of the Simons Collaboration on the Theory of Algorithmic Fairness. Reingold has held positions at Samsung Research America, the Weizmann Institute of Science, Microsoft Research, the Institute of Advanced Study, and AT&T Labs. His research is in the foundations of computer science and most notably in computational complexity, cryptography, and the societal impact of computation. He is an ACM Fellow, a Simons Investigator, and among his distinctions are the 2005 Grace Murray Hopper Award and the 2009 Gödel Prize. Welcome, Omer. And last up, we have the wonderful Patricia Williams, who is a pioneer of both law and literature and critical race theory movements in American legal theory. And she is a University Distinguished Professor of Law and Humanities of Northeastern University and a Professor Emerita at Columbia Law School. She's also the Director of Law, Technology, and Ethics Initiatives in the School of Law and College of Social Sciences and Humanities. Tons of awards, of which I'll just kind of recap a few. She is she's won a MacArthur Genius Award. She's at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Science, and she's at the Radcliffe Institute. She's written tons of publications, and her latest book, Giving a Damn, Race, Romance, and Gone with the Wind, is forthcoming from HarperCollins in June 2021. Welcome, Patricia. I'm so grateful to have you all here. Welcome, panelists. Okay, so first I would like to ask, so many of you on the panel are professors and researchers for whom the topic of fairness has become an area of interest. Could you explain how you came to this topic and how your background has shaped your thinking about ethics in AI? We'll just go kind of maybe in a loop. So Sendhil, we'll start with you.
It's a great question. So I actually arrived at this because I've been working on human bias for quite some time. And there's a lot of work documenting large amounts of discrimination by people against other people. And that's sort of what I had, been doing for the last 20 years. And when we started doing work with these algorithms, it became sort of a natural intersection of these. But there's some tension between these actually that I think is kind of both interesting, productive tension, but also, and that really got me, and I'm very far from understanding it, the productive tension being, we know one algorithm is extremely biased, whatever is inside of our heads. We know one algorithm is extremely black box, what is inside of our heads. And so when I come at it from that perspective, everything people say about AI algorithms, it's nothing new. And in fact, that is what we know about humans. I mean, take every sentence we know, you kind of do it. And from another perspective, however, there is something new about these, and I thought this was excellent in your film. There's the sort of presumption of objectivity that algorithms and data kind of put onto things. And so for me, a lot of it has been about trying to understand how we really reconcile these two things and what their differences are and what we can do with them together.
Fantastic. Omer, how about you?
First, thank you for inviting me to join this wonderful panel on this wonderful important movie. So I'm a researcher in theoretical computer science, mathematical foundations of computer science, and that's where I come to this area. I started from the area of cryptography and moved naturally to privacy, and then in 2010 started to look into algorithmic discrimination. And I think the crypto side and the theoretical computer side bring kind of two slightly complementary perspectives that I think that I bring. So the crypto side brings a lot of suspicion and skepticism. I remember 25 years ago in a crypto conference as a student, and everybody kind of walking to dinner, expecting the NSA is monitoring their personal discussions. But also on the technical side, this understanding, this view of everything from the perspective of an adversary that's trying to exploit and trying to break your definitions. And so that's kind of one side. And that side also kind of taught me the importance of rigor and definitions, because if you look at something like encryption, for example, you see that you can have some definitions, but then you see that there is another way to attack these definitions, and that way you kind of progress your understanding and get to more nuanced understanding of what you're doing. And it's so much better to argue about what definitions make sense rather than arguing if a system is good or bad. So that's kind of that side of the equation. The theory side, I think, brings some optimism. And I think it's important to bring some optimism to an area that's so, kind of that brings so much pessimism, right? It's so worrisome when you look at the impact of algorithms and how far we are from understanding how to handle them in a way that would be useful. But what we've seen in theory, in the theory of computer science in different areas, is how we did manage to have important impact, not to solve everything, but to have important impact in different areas like biology and then physics and econ and social sciences. And without, of course, trying to replace the people that are experts in all of these areas, but bringing the computational perspective. And we are in our first steps of trying to do the same within algorithmic fairness. And we need a lot of optimism against this challenge.
Absolutely. How about you, Patricia?
Yeah, I'm a lawyer, so I think some of the first emergences of this problem are when the people depicted in this film and depicted in Virginia Eubanks's book actually started to sue. And so from a very early stage, I think lawyers have been quite aware of how this clashes with questions of civil rights and things that are embedded in public law. And so I view this as a kind of clash of governance systems. On the one hand, we have, at least theoretically, a model of public law that is based on transparency, participatory democracy, input, understanding of, understanding of exactly what's of oversight, basically, of oversight. And that's kind of in tension with proprietary models or private law, contract law, which has a different governance system. That is to say, corporations are governed by bylaws. And so the obligation, the ethical obligation, is to the bottom line. It is to the investors, the shareholders, the stakeholders who are not citizens. And therefore, the human subject in a corporate model is at best a consumer, but otherwise a product. And that's very different from the shape of and the configuration of citizenship. These have different temporal models, different vocabularies. So, a corporation values speed. It values what was called value added at one point. It values, it puts great primacy on risk assessment as enshrining a kind of expectation for the future. And a lot of our law is about due process for what happens in the present to an individual body, rather than, again, the values of the kind of epidemiological models that algorithms enshrine. This, I think, highlights the second concern I have, which is that you're really talking about two different discourses as well. So on the one hand, a deliberative vocabulary is a much more, I think that perhaps the contrast is captured by what philosopher Rosie Braidotti has described as, she opens one of her books with an example of what we do every time we encounter that CAPTCHA, prove that you are human, prove that you're not a robot. And the test of humanity by that test is whether you can identify a spark plug or a bicycle or a taxi cab. And that's a very limited notion of what it means to be human. And when you think about that much more, its algorithms are much more complex than that simple thing, but they don't, but there's a way in which that quantitative vocabulary in which, as they said, algorithms are about math. A mathematical vocabulary as the basis for this kind of human understanding takes out a lot of what we think of as the human. Now, again, law may do it as well. In law, we have constructions of the human that are the juridical subject that is homo economicus, and there are lots of ways in which we are also reductive. But I think a mathematical vocabulary really does value a kind of binarism as code, binary as code. It is not yet, certainly it's growing in that direction, as nuanced to be able to understand the question of irony. It is harder, I think, to disaggregate the individual from the collective, the epidemiological, and again, the probabilistic, and that's just built into the way in which we have these particular models. I don't think it's necessarily so, but that's what we're dealing with. And I think that's just, as a part of the architecture, one of the bigger problems in the translation that needs to be done between these two systemic roles of oversight.
Very insightful, Patricia. Seny, you were the last person on our panel we haven't heard from yet. How about you?
Yeah, so for me, it's just always been like a natural question, right? So, I'm a professor now, but more fundamentally, I'm Black, and I was always Black. So as a kid, right, like bias and discrimination was always there in healthcare and education, and with police brutality and police harassment. And so what that does is that sort of creates a situation where you're conditioned to think about bias and discrimination, but you're also conditioned to think about it in terms of like systemic problems, right? Not just individual, like somebody doesn't like me, but also like, why is this happening to me, right? Like, why is like the educational system the way it is? Why is the criminal justice system the way it is, right? So this is how you grew up, and this is how you analyze things. And so as I became a computer scientist, it was a natural like frame of mind. It was a natural perspective to have on my own field, right? And so initially I was very disappointed with computer science as a whole, because as a field, I didn't think that we cared about social issues and we cared about ethical issues or anything. It just wasn't part of our curriculum, at least when I was a student. And I think that disappointment kind of changed into horror as I saw how much influence computer science was having on people's lives, right? There was like a shift. Back when I was a student, we thought of algorithms as things that was running in operating systems, and it would run like your browser and your word processor, right? But then there was a shift where now it was affecting people's everyday lives, and that just kind of scared me, because I never felt like we were equipped, we were properly equipped to be building systems and algorithms of that sort, right? It's fundamentally different. So all of these things kind of played a role in me thinking about these problems.
It's such a wide-ranging array of viewpoints through which people are kind of arriving to a common locus. Very, very fascinating. I'm wondering, given your experiences so far with ethics and AI, are there any areas where you think that algorithms are particularly well suited to help with decision-making? And conversely, are there any areas where you think algorithms shouldn't be used at all in decision-making? We can go in any order, or anyone can jump in. Patricia.
Can I just say, I don't think that that's an either or answer. I actually think that part of what we have to do, the real challenge, is what David Santos said. Algorithms are alive, he said. We don't think of them as alive. We think of them as neutral, disembodied, not human, and therefore that becomes some sort of new equivalence of fairness. I think it's exactly the opposite. I think that we can make algorithms alive by revealing precisely who are the programmers, who makes the decision, if not the programmers, who or what attribute are we selling or building into the machines. And so I think that they do need to be made alive, which is to say to reconnect the mental constructions of the developers to the mathematical constructions of the outcome. And without doing that, they operate autonomously on their own, but the language that we keep attributing to it of self-generating, autonomous, autopoietic does not have to be. We can attach that, and I think one of the big walls against making that kind of aliveness, human aliveness, to this disembodied world is precisely the realm of the proprietary, that trade secrets, that somehow the fact that these codes are completely black boxed is a huge problem. Again, it does not have to be that way, but as long as those black box decisions are making human decisions in the name of these ciphers, which stand in for us as products, then it's rendering us as products. It's rendering us as civiliter mortuus, as we say in law. It's rendering us civilly dead because it's disenfranchising us in the name of the products we seem to have become.
So Patricia, I'll give you an example. The AI Now Institute, for example, has called for emotion detection algorithms to be banned. And you might agree or not agree with that. That's an area in which they cite algorithms are inappropriately used and maybe ought not to be used. That shouldn't be something we can predict. And so I'm just wondering if that, for you guys, it's just a matter of making the algorithms better, and in principle, as long as we beat the human, we should be applying them in all domains, or in principle, does there exist an area in which AI just ought not to be used? Does that clarify at all?
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. It is, in fact, I think, well posed, because it's part of what I think the way people are trying to approach the problem right now. Is there a place we can use these? When should we outlaw it? And I think maybe I'll take a similar vein to what Patricia did, which is, I think we should be asking, even though that's the question everyone is asking, I think we should be asking a different question. And let me try and articulate what that is. So this showed up in the discussion of Daniel Santos, and I thought the discussion of what makes a good teacher. So if you look at it, for a lot of these, I think our attempts to apply AI to these problems is actually revealing deeper questions that are being poorly answered, and then that's where the problem is coming. So what makes a good teacher? Well, we've already, in a crappy way, answered that question well before AI. We have teacher incentives, we have promotion boards that look at these things that have already, in the past, decided on bad metrics to a degree, and those bad metrics are now being codified into the algorithms. So if we step back and say, let's not think of areas like emotion detection. Let's actually think of how are we taking problems that we discuss nebulously and transforming them into something quantifiable. Whether an algorithm is going to act on that quantification or whether we as humans are going to act on that quantification. What's the process by which we take something in the world and then turn it into something quantifiable? Almost all the slips I know of happen at that point, because the complexity in the world is suddenly lost and is compressed, and a lot of the things happen. So if I were to describe where I think the misapplications are, I think the misapplications arise because we've not been reflective enough and kicked the tires enough and said, wait, this thing, good teacher, is being represented by this number. Do we really think this is a good representation of that? Whether an algorithm operates on it or we give out awards to teach, I mean, irrespective, and that type of reduction happens in many, many domains. And in my experience, a lot of, not all, but many of the problems arise from there, which at least for me helps ask the question, okay, what are the situations where that reduction is possible? What are the situations where we think that reduction is truly crazy? And kind of, at least, it doesn't fully answer your question. I know I'm sidestepping a little bit. It gives me kind of a structure in which I can look at the stuff in the world and kind of make some sense of it.
Yeah.
I just want to add to that. I'm so appreciating the diversity of backgrounds on this approaches to this question. I think for me, it's in that question of who's the we, and the question I would sort of reframe as not whether they're good applications of AI and bad and times that should be banned, but I think the larger question to me is who gets to decide. And right now, it's just technology companies and law enforcement with no one that we elected giving any kind of oversight to what happens. And it's my feeling that someone that represents we the people, someone that I elected and can hold accountable, should be a part of that process. And I think what I've seen, because I don't have a computer science background, it wasn't until making this film that I could even had the literacy to be like, that's not data science, that's complete bogus baloney pseudoscience that's being sold by a private company to make a bunch of money. And it's very hard for people to discern. And I think, if anything, I'm in favor of what Kathy O'Neill calls for in the film, which is an FDA for algorithms, some sort of body that would vet these systems. Who's to say, maybe there is a use of an application of facial recognition that I would be, maybe you go before a judge and you get a warrant for this specific usage in this context. And I think that right now we're living, I feel like what's happening in the industry is that it's like living in an industry with like the automobile industry before we had car seats for your baby, or pharmaceutical products that don't have usage guidelines or counterindications. And so to me, it's more about the fact that we have an entirely like what's described in the film as like a wild, wild west, sort of an unregulated industry. And to me, the larger question is about who gets to decide what is a fair usage and a proper usage of these technologies.
Yeah, and I think that decisional process is also very much boggled to some degree by the vocabulary, because we are viewing this as product testing and instead of human experimentation. And what we are doing is human experimentation.
I want to add perhaps that, people think perhaps some domains are so sensitive we shouldn't use algorithms like incarceration, but perhaps somewhere else like targeted advertising, it's okay. But I want to say that even something as benign as targeted advertising can have a huge impact on the lives of people. It affects what kind of credit you get, what kind of jobs you're aware of, what's your political opinions. So I can't think of any domain in which we don't need a lot of scrutiny in the usage of algorithms.
What an array of fantastic answers, Seny. If you want to hop in, or maybe I can answer ask another question.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything everybody said, were great answers. I mean, I think we have a tendency, especially us computer scientists, is we want to automate everything because that's how we're trained, right? So it's like we don't even think before we automate, and that's an issue, because again, there's been a shift, right? It used to be that we were automating things that affected machines, but now we're automating things or those machines are affecting people. And so we need to really rethink how we make that decision, right, on what we automate. And I think our instinct should be to not automate, right, when it comes to decision making, when it comes to affecting people. And then we should ask ourselves, well, is it okay to automate this, instead of the other way around, where we just try to automate everything and then we ask, oh, well, maybe this isn't right, right? So, I think we do need to change how we go about these things. And I think, what Patricia suggested in terms of the vocabulary is really important, right? Viewing it as human experimentation, is one way to, I think, change how people really, and, especially the people who are creating these algorithms, how they think and relate to what they're doing. So.
Absolutely. Such great answers. So the movie focused a lot on the harmful impact of technical errors and misspecifications and accuracy issues, as well as on the broader normative concerns of design and power. Who gets to decide all these decision points in developing an AI technology or application? So what role do you think scholars coming from a technical discipline can and should play in thinking through these various aspects of fairness in tech and ML?
I mean, so I think, I think we have a role, but I think we're ill-equipped to really be leading the discussions and leading the creation of the technology. Because again, we're not trained to do so, right? Like our education doesn't prepare us and doesn't equip us to really think deeply and broadly about, the impacts on human beings and on societies, on all of these things. And so until we start educating computer scientists and technologists differently, which I hope we will, I hope, like the CS majors and curriculums will expand beyond STEM to social sciences and humanities as well. But until that happens, I think we're really gonna have to be dependent on folks from other fields to, I think, take the lead and give us the context and give us the questions and give us the problems and evaluate whatever answers we come up with.
One of the things, and this I think relates to the point you made, Shalini, which I really like, which is when we think about evaluation, in a narrow machine learning sense, it's got these sort of like type 1 errors, type 2 errors. It's sort of classic statistics. You use the metric, you get the expected value. But who decides that's the metric? Not the statistical part, but that's the dimension by which we think success is happening. Like in a pretrial algorithm to decide who gets bail, who decides what constitutes a crime? Who decides, maybe we care about other things. Maybe we care about impact of the person being in jail on their families. Maybe we care about their emotional well-being. Who decides the dimensions along which we are even going to do the evaluation? And there's a second question, which involves governance, which is who is doing the evaluation. And both of these dimensions, I think, are just practically, if you look at the algorithms that are out there right now, huge shortfalls on both these dimensions. Like even if all the technical things were perfectly well done, we just simply don't have any form of independent value. Like cities buy, it's an insane situation that somebody comes to you and says, I have this thing, it works. How do we know? I say so. Great, let's do it. Like in no other area are people so blindly naive to think that like on your word, and that's what happens with these face detection algorithms, with all these things. So in that sense, the lack of independence, but even if you move past independence, this sort of failure to think about who's deciding what constitutes the dimensions on which we should be doing the evaluating, I think that resonated a lot with me when you put it that way. And I think that's something that we just simply don't have a very good process right now, even anywhere that I've seen on that. Even within companies, by the way, like we talk about companies as if they're monolithic, but you have an ad team. The ad team says, well, we're just going to focus on click-through rates. But if that results in a bunch of ads that people don't like, and then that has consequences that people leave the platform altogether, well, the rest of the company may dislike that. And then of course, companies are trying to deal with that, but you see that tension even within the narrow profit maximizing grinding thing, which is what's the objective, what is the metric that we should be using is not a thing that we've currently figured out a reasonable way to resolve that problem.
I think that's also just a problem of the degree to which agency in all of this is so disguised. As long as one can say that this is simply a mathematical calculation, then the ethics of this as a human enterprise or as a propagandistic classification system that is akin to segregation and is akin to justice questions of public accommodation, then that agency is completely irrelevant or invisible. For me, it also goes back to just the general deficits of our education system, which has increasingly placed exclusive emphasis on STEM and has cut out arts, has cut out literature, has cut out sociology and the larger understandings of what civic enterprise is about, what affect is about, but what the sensorium of responses that one calls empathy and sympathy and everything else, that those count, and that there are metrics for those that are built into justice systems that are being excluded because science students by and large have been increasingly exempted from any notion of what the humanities actually mean. And it's simply playing with paints as opposed to these profound senses of what makes us act civilly toward one another or among each other.
So I want to add a few things. One is this term technologist hide a lot of different communities that sometimes are viewed as one monolithic group. So even within computer science, there are different disciplines with very different objectives. Machine learning people are not like system people, are not like theoretical computer science people. And those are not necessarily like the software engineers in companies or the CEOs or perhaps the Wall Street executives that are driving quite a bit of these decisions and are all put in this one bucket. And I think that it's important to understand the different roles that each one of us play. I want to say that so I'll kind of focus more on my small area, which is the theoretical computer scientists. And I want to say that I think that we are important, not, of course, as replacing society or policymakers or social scientists, but we do have a role in adding, I think, important language. So, econ gives language to talk about it, and statistics gives language, and law and philosophy. And when you're talking about something like algorithms, that is a completely different beast, you do need the language of computation. I would argue that there is no way to have a nuanced discussion of algorithmic fairness without the language that we need to develop. And we have a lot of catching up to do, but this is an important part in it. In addition, I think what we can do is offer new options and also understand limitations that policy makers can then take. So I'll give an example from a different area, which is privacy. So this new notion of differential privacy, or 10-year-old notion, is a new option for policymakers to take. So if before the options in terms of data analysis was not to run the experiment or to use a very weak anonymization methods, or to do everything and to let everything leak, now we have another option. So I think that our role is to make the range of things that policymakers can do much wider. And I mean, I'm thinking sometimes about this Berlin Wall analogy. So yeah, perhaps we needed activists and politicians to take the Berlin Wall down, but eventually you also needed engineers to help in this task. And algorithmic fairness is way more complicated than taking a wall down.
Yeah, it truly is a multidisciplinary effort. I definitely want to ask about that. But before I do, the notion or the sentiment of needing an FDA for algorithms arose in your film and has risen a lot in various conversations. So I wanted to ask if anybody's thought a little bit more about what that could look like. Is there a sense in which we could codify a set of rules, or is there some sort of elected body that would decide on a case-by-case basis what would be good governance? I feel like even the question of how to govern systems and how to get more input and share in power is very much murky. So I would like to get kind of your thoughts, the panelists, if you have any ideas for how that would look.
I can give it a try as a non-computer scientist, but as a lawyer.
Yes.
And one of the things that it seems to me is really difficult about this is the sort of blind faith. And Omar, I absolutely agree with you that this is complex, that that's why I don't want to answer the question about, yes or no. I mean, computation of course has a role. I mean, and these are different vocabularies, but the general failure to demand more accountability, to demand more openness, is something that deflection, it seems to me, is a deferral to a kind of totalitarianism. I view that totalitarianism is not state totalitarianism, but a kind of monopoly totalitarianism, that we've allowed certain companies to become hugely monopolistic, as was underscored in the film. And that is a form of control that, because it's also proprietary, we can't interrogate. And so that's the beginning of the problem. The other is, again, the siloing of different vocabularies so that nobody's talking to one another. And that when somebody like me comes and starts talking to computer scientists, they say, well, you don't know anything about science, and besides it's all neutral and it's not human. And that's the question of attributed agency that I pointed out. I absolutely agree that there are governance systems within that computational world, like differential privacy. I think, and the question of making things open source. So it's not just that government can be public, but also that the computational languages are open and open source, open code. I think is a very important part, taking it out of the proprietary secrets of trade secrets.
I can build a little bit on that. I think the FDA model is kind of an appealing metaphor because it's out there, it works, it feels like a molecule. I think for some things it could work well. For example, algorithms in medicine, very different task, very whatever. For a variety of other things, things aren't nearly so discrete, and algorithms sort of diffuse through many different aspects. And it as sort of as a metaphor, it works, but and I like what you just said, Patricia, because in some sense, let's take open source and making it open. A different analogy could be accounting. So we have a huge set of legal infrastructure that imposes a ton of regulations on firms about what they can and can't do with accounting, what information they have to make public. And accounts are very secretive things, but we still have regulations that say, even if you don't make this public, you have to store all this information that these regulators can access at any time. So we actually have huge amounts of documentation and transparency regulations in place for financial accounting and finance in general. And of course, firms would like to do away with them, but they exist and they allow our economy to function well. I would hope we get to that point at a minimum for algorithms. That is, that we ought to be able to say, look, if a regulator wants to go in and say, I'm worried that the pricing algorithm used by this company is whatever, they shouldn't be able to say, well, that code, we don't have any. It's like, no, you should have been keeping all of that. You give us all of your training data, give us the code backup. Guess what? Storage is dirt cheap. Give it, download to us, and we'll see what shenanigans you pulled. If you go to banking, for example, and you want to understand whether a bank, some of you may not know this, but if you want to know whether a bank is engaged in discrimination, there are examiners that are sent to the bank's offices. They pull all the physical files. Every single one has been kept. They go through page by page and they track down where there may have been slippage. And all of that has to be kept. So if they can keep every last little piece of paper for purposes of compliance with racial discrimination, they can certainly keep every aspect of the algorithm and the training process that they've used. That is infinitely cheaper. So at a minimum, I think that type of, I'm not saying that's all we do, but that type of regulation, I think, would seem to me essential. Like, I don't even know why we don't have that today.
So I view this question of regulation as one of the one that directs me most. So when I do research on algorithmic fairness, this is one question I kind of have in mind. If somehow somebody calls me and asks me, okay, we plan to get serious. We plan to have regulations that will really put these companies into stricter conditions. What should we do? And that's kind of what I view as my role, is to have some answer on a part of it, not on all of it. But and I fear that at the moment I don't have great answers yet. And I completely agree with Patricia, but I mean, not growing in the US, I always found it fascinating how much suspicion there is towards the government, but how little suspicion there is towards companies that are sometimes as powerful, if not more. But I'll try to give one answer, which is, or two answers, which are very, very partial. And of course, the answers should come from various different areas. So they should come also from process and inclusion in the decision and the diversity of decision makers and all of that. But on a technical level, one thing that I find that I would have liked to push is a moratorium on personalization, unless it can show to be refined enough for all communities and all sub-communities. So one issue is that algorithms, like humans, are stereotyping. Because they are trying to optimize one thing. So in the movie, there was this portrayed that you have data and then the algorithm just do their stuff, but we also tell them what to do with the data in order to find an algorithm. We tell them what to optimize, and usually we tell them to optimize something global. But when you optimize something global, perhaps you don't care about some local areas, and this is a complete sub-community. So one thing I would say is that if your personalization views an entire sub-community as one, then this is the definition of an algorithm that is stereotyping. So we should not allow personalization based on data that is not refined enough to allow you to discriminate within communities, to separate different entities within all the sub-communities that we care about. So this could be an example of something we can care about. And another answer is about labeling, like we ask for foods. Perhaps I don't know what you should do, but please tell me, what do you do? The problem with that is that we kind of think of these 5 or 7 companies that are trading with our data, but the problem is that there are dozens of companies that trade with our data. And most of them we didn't hear about. And they don't have a reputation to lose by telling us that, oh, you know, I don't care about privacy. So this is just a partial solution. So I'm even more worried about the companies that we don't know their names than the companies that we do know their names. And I'm very worried about those too. Yeah, we are very, very early, and I wish we had, the industry is running because the utility is so huge, the money is so huge, and we are running a little bit behind.
Yeah, and I think it's no accident that the United States is the site of this free-for-all, as somebody in the movie described it, but it's really a price for all. And part of it is the product precisely of the enormous anti-government movement and the capitulation from everything from Citizens United, where corporations have huge governance power, and that governance has been privatized. And I think that's really a problem, because we do have governance structures. And when one looks at the pervasiveness of what not just algorithms, but all of artificial intelligence is doing in our media, we used to have a fairness doctrine. What if we brought that back? Tim Wu, one of my former colleagues at Columbia, has written about net neutrality. You know, we've pushed that back. We have IRBs for certain kinds of research. Those IRBs are not brought into this vocabulary in terms of overseeing the kind of human experimentation that we are doing with poor communities, as was pointed out in this film. Medical technology, black box medical technology makes mistakes because it's building in formulas that go back hundreds of years that are mistakes of racialized embodiments. And it seems to me that we have, you know, we ought to bear in mind the Nuremberg Code. I mean, we have these ethical reference systems that don't become part of the vocabulary, again, because it seems to me we have, again, buried the agency in as the pure scientific language of math speaking itself into being.
Great answers. You know, we're also as academics embedded in systems that incentivize certain kinds of research. I know, Seny, you have encouraged kind of us to pursue more socially leaning research instead of commercially leaning research. And Sendhil, you also have a project which showed that if you make social, or rather, if you make consumer-facing decisions like healthcare cost a priority, you can end up discriminating. And so again and again, we see when we prioritize maybe more the commercial, it might have these external effects that are unintended. And so I don't know if the rest of you have encountered this in your experience or research, but if you guys could speak on that misalignment that sometimes happens even for us as researchers. Would love to hear your thoughts.
I can dive in. This goes back to, I think, to the very first question you started off with. Maybe the second question about what areas of application. I think one thing, and it's related to the point, Shalini, you made about who controls it. I think one of the biggest distortions we see is the kinds of applications to which this technology is being used. It's usually being used to one where some private actor stands to have some private gain from that technology. And in some sense, for what, you know, because that's where the data is easy, because that's who hires people, academic research tends to just sort of follow that as well. So it's like, we have a huge set of research on optimizing ad targeting, which, you know, while it's an interesting problem, it's hardly going to be thinking like, so I'll give an example. You know, if you take a first generation college kid who's never been to college, show up at the first day. Now they're face a very difficult problem. Should I take the math class that's, you know, the standard one? Should I take a lower level one, or should I take a higher level one? It's actually an insanely hard problem. Just put yourself in that kid's shoe. It's hard because if you take one that's too easy, actually you will have used up some valuable time, and wasted credits are like one of the things that in the data you see leads people to drop out. If you take one that's too hard, I mean, that's dispiriting. You might be wondering, do I even belong here, blah, blah, blah. So who helps me make that choice? Well, in practice, the reality is there's a guidance counselor you would go to who might have 5 minutes for you, and I don't know, they look at it and say, oh, you look blah, blah. But the tragedy of that is that just even in a system like CUNY or any of these systems, there is so much data on other students just like you who have taken exactly the classes you did in high school, who got the grades you did, that can tell us how they did, blah, blah, blah. Now this problem is very, very familiar, because that same kid, when they go home to sit in front of Netflix and wants to figure out how to spend the next 2 hours of their life, have the world's best data scientists to say, well, you like these movies based on that, blah, blah, blah. What a weird misallocation that, like, to decide what might dictate the future of my life. And so that kind of misallocation of like simply not having talent attempting to solve those problems and trying to, and people dictating, like starting with the student themselves, like this is the thing I need, and I really have this pressing uncertainty, taking other people's voices to decide how the algorithm should be built, but you kind of need the technical talent to pull the data together and try and do stuff. I think that's probably the biggest distortion in the entire space. It's simply, we're not working on those type of problems at all. And that to me is kind of tragic.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of add on to that, I mean, I think this is, as you pointed out, what I was getting at sort of in my talk last summer, and it's this realization that, like, I worked at Microsoft Research, and then I went to Brown, and I have a startup company, and that's all great, right? But like all the problems that I worked on and that all of my peers worked on are problems that in the end will, have an impact on industry, which is fine. Like, again, I have a startup company, right? But I don't know why that's the case. Like, why is it that like all of us and everything we do 100% is focused on that, right? Like in the movie, there was this community in Brownsville in Brooklyn, right? And it's like, they also need to benefit from technology, from AI, from cryptography, from all of these things. But who is actually sitting down and looking at what technical problems they need solved and solving those problems, right? None of my colleagues are doing that. I'm not doing that.
Well, Joy is. Sorry. Go, Joy.
Right, yeah. But you see, like, this was kind of the issue that I had, right? And that was bugging me. And so, and the great thing about the movie is I think it sort of, it underlines that, right? It highlights that.
Well, I think this is what you're saying is exactly what I meant when I said we've had this stunning lack of imagination around these technologies and how they're used. And I think that has everything to do with the economic model that Shoshana Zuboff refers to as surveillance capitalism. And I've often thought of it, my last film was about solutions to climate change and how solar could uplift the lives of working people. And to me, running an economy off of surveillance capitalism is as unsustainable as running a society off of fossil fuels. It's the same kind of extractive, short-sighted, bad for democracy and civilization kind of economic model that fuels everything. And to me, it's that economic model. It's not just like the issues around inclusion, but it's that economic model of extracting data. And the other thing is that the fact that, 9 companies now are what Patricia was saying, this totalitarian kind of have this kind of huge power over society. When you think about a company like Google accounting for 90% of the knowledge searches globally throughout the world, I mean, that is incredible to me. And the fact that that's not actually a knowledge platform, that's an advertising platform. And I'm concerned that we won't actually have innovation in this field, and that we don't know what AI for public good could look like, partly because these 9 companies in the US and China that lead AI have a 15 or 20-year head start on the consolidation of our data. And then the other thing is just this model of the surveillance capitalism model, in which companies, basically we work for them, where they're extracting all of our data with no economic benefit and no rights to us, and using that to fuel their economy and get rich off of it. And that to me is part of the issue.
I wanted to jump in, just that we have, I think, only 5 minutes in there.
Yeah, I want to do Q&A. Sorry about that, Jeffy. We do have some questions from our audience, which I want to get to. So Tina asked an accountability question. Who is legally responsible when an algorithm causes harm to a human? For example, is it the judge who used the risk assessment tool, or the company that released the software? How do we assign accountability? Anyone want to take that on?
I mean, I do think that this is a real challenge for our law as it's present constructed, where you don't have an agent that can be assigned culpability. And that's, to me, the slipperiest part of this structure of disembodying the way in which algorithms work. Yeah, I suppose one can make the judge who relies upon an algorithm capable in some response, but that's not really, as you can feel, where the bottom culpability is. And so I think it presents huge structural issues when you are deciding somebody's liberty in a parole hearing, for example, based on their zip code, to things like freedom of association. It means that you are not being judged, as our entire legal system says, by the body and the person and the behaviors in front of you as at least theoretically conceived of as autonomous, but instead you're judging them by with whom they study, by whom they are associating, or where they live. And that, again, epidemiological perspective is not something our law has been evolved to deal with. And I think we have to take back that sense of process due and the bottom line notion of what deliberative means, which is that the efficient way of saying, well, you're like all of these and therefore we can make a quick decision because you're probabilistically going to do this. No, our legal system is supposed to take time. And so one of the things that this does is it makes it sleek and efficient and it's econometrically, quantitatively right a lot of the time, but to the degree it's wrong, we don't have a well-designed cause of action. And so I think there's got to be a new consumer movement, a new citizen movement, both of those together, both citizen and consumer movement, to be able to express it in those terms.
Ben and Rebecca have very similar questions, which is, will better engineering practices help mitigate bias, or is it a fundamentally different approach needed? And again, asking about different approaches. And it seems as though the consensus of this panel is we do need different ways of thinking and organizing and being around AI progress. Although I wanted to ask, do you see more room for just kind of on the algorithmic side or the technological side for developments and insights?
As you said many times, it's a multidisciplinary area, and the way I think it has to work is not like each one of us do their own thing separately, and we need to do all of that. We need to develop our core areas separately, but we also need to work together. And so I don't think that we can engineers can pull themselves in their own, using their own air just by themselves. We need to do it together. And we need also activists, just as Patricia said. And I think that's why the movie is so important, because it brings awareness to something that otherwise is just in the mind of some researchers.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I think, let me add 2 points. One is sort of an extreme version of saying engineering is not going to solve it, which is if you, at least all the ones that I know, the sort of the documented ones where we can actually see the problem and the genesis of the problem, the algorithms always did exactly what they were programmed to do. There was no technical failure. This is not, I think there's a way to think about this that's analogous to bugs from software engineering, and we got better at dealing with bugs. These are not bugs. The code did it exactly as it was planned. There was no bug in the code. There was a problem in what we asked the algorithm to do, but that's not an engineer. So in that one sense, I think it's clear engineering advances along that vector are not going to solve this. But in another sense, I think there are some useful and important things, which is as we enrich the question of like get more people to tell us what we want algorithms to do, build richer objective functions, describe those objective functions, I think that then does raise interesting technical challenges around how do we actually solve and build algorithms for these richer objective functions, because these richer objective functions can be much more complicated to deal with. For example, just to take the most trivial point, what do you do when some populations are represented very rarely in the data? How do you, just as a technical point, if your objective function isn't simply do well on average, but incorporate some sort of group level things, and you know some people are just very underrepresented, how do you learn from small data points? And so I think technical problems will follow, but I think for the problems we're trying to solve, we actually have no technical problems. And I think it'd be a mistake to think, oh, just let this train run along and it's going to fix itself.
So I would also add, like, again, I think there is a role for engineers and computer scientists to solve some problems, right? But the challenge is that, again, here we're dealing with people, right? And decisions that are going to affect people's lives. And so, like, that's a much more subtle and more nuanced and more important setting than what we're used to dealing with, right? Because again, if I drop a piece of code or drop an algorithm in an operating system, okay, fine, right? This is what's going to happen. But when I drop an algorithm or you know, a decision-making algorithm in a community, right, that is going to affect individuals, is going to affect their family, that's going to affect their communities. You know, there's a lot of factors around this, right? There's going to be consequences that are, you know, that are happening because of history, right? Because of politics and because of like the financial situation. There's all of these things that matter and that have to be taken into account if you're designing systems that are impacting people. And that's a really hard thing to do. And the problem is that if we're just in our corner, you know, designing our algorithms like we normally do with our normal process, right, the way we've always done it, that just doesn't translate. Or, I mean, what's going to happen is essentially, you know, we could design solutions that we think are great, but they're going to have huge harms, right, inside of the communities when they're actually deployed, which is what we're seeing. So, you know, so I think in addition, you know, we also need completely new ways, not only of educating computer scientists, but of working, right, of really doing our work.
Practicing, yeah. Do you think the incentives are there? Do you think that's doable? Okay.
I don't, I mean, you know, we all know, or I shouldn't say we all know, but, you know, I mean, you know, some of the panelists have talked, you know, already about the financial incentives and you know, financial incentives and capitalism and how everything is set up, right? So that's there. You know, my kind of original thought first was that, oh, well, you know, maybe academia, right, can come to the rescue because we're not supposed to be motivated by the same things as industry. But those of us in academia also kind of know and understand intuitively that like the incentives aren't really aligned for people to do this work, right? Some of us do it and some people do it, but that's really their own kind of like motivation, right? The incentives like aren't really set up for that. So, you know, so that's something that we could change, and hopefully we will, because I think academia has a kind of a golden opportunity to do something here that is important and impactful that industry isn't doing. And when I say academia here, I mean really computer science academia. I think other parts of academia have been doing this and are focused on this, right? So here I mean more like the STEM fields. You know, I think that's where we've missed our opportunity to have an impact on the world and to do something unique. So hopefully we will do that.
Absolutely. No one else wants to chime in. I think, Shafi, we have time for perhaps one more question or two.
I think we have more. I think
more time, right?
Yeah, it ends.
Okay, good. I was afraid my time management was off, but I'm glad you knew.
To tell you the truth, the clock on my computer is wrong, so it's all the machine.
Oh, okay, because you were like, we have 5 minutes. Okay, well, sorry about that. Good with the time reconciliation. Okay, so I will. I will read off another comment. So someone asked, as tech workers, we negotiate for higher salaries and better benefits all the time. Is there space for us to learn how to negotiate stronger ethical practices when we negotiate job offers? So I guess coming from the tech side, is there space for agency with regards to ethics? What can we do? What can be done? I suppose we're a panel of academics and we don't necessarily sit inside that wheelhouse, but.
I can just say from friends that are there that I think that these companies are more afraid about losing their own talent than they are about public pressures. So I think that it has been shown to be very powerful that some of these companies, it's the employees that drove change. I hope that there will be more of public pressure, but I think that employees are very, very important, and they proved it in several occasions.
You know, going back to the previous point made about interactions or what we can do, I think this film was so important because we saw Joy taking on a lot of what academics typically don't do. She testified before Congress and really on behalf of other people. And so I'm wondering, do you see the role of researchers interacting with the public expanding, and whether you see the nature of that role changing? Is there potential for it to change, and how? Anyway.
Well, I just wanted to say that I meet a lot of brilliant, conscientious people who work inside of these tech companies. And it's my hope that they will obey their sense of true north when they have a moment in one of these halls of power where they have a moment like Trinae Moran has, where she says, I just know something's not right here. And I think that I have seen a pattern with tech companies of discrediting and dismissing independent scholars that shine a light on bias that disrupts their business model, like the firing of Dr. Timnit Gebru from Google. And I think it takes both things. I think it takes people from inside these companies. And I think one of the things I think they do respond to is, and what was heartening about Dr. Gebru's firing was that 2,500 of her colleagues stood up with her and did this virtual walkout, and there were resignations in that midst. And I think that people within these companies definitely have a role to play. And I think that when I think about what makes change, it is definitely people who have the power of the scientific method. I mean, I couldn't distill this to you. I relied on people like on this panel that have this knowledge. And I think to quote Spider-Man here, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think, you know, for this audience to understand that in understanding artificial intelligence, you have an immense power that 90% of the population does not have. And when I think about the fact that after Coded Bias released, that 3 of the biggest tech companies in the world changed their policy of their use of facial recognition to law enforcement. IBM, in an unprecedented move, disrupted their entire business model and got out of the game. They won't research it. They won't deploy it. They're done with facial recognition. Microsoft said that they would not sell to law enforcement, and Amazon took a 1-year pause. And to me, that sea change really was possible in part because of brave scientists speaking truth to power unencumbered by corporate interest. And we need people who have that conviction of character to tell the truth and to tell the public the truth. I think the other thing is we need massive science literacy. That is not just science literacy. And it's my hope also that in these rooms of power that there are also ethicists and legal scholars, and not, my mantra is like sort of don't leave the tech bros alone. You know, that's really important. But I think AI literacy of a massive scale is what I'd like to see, and investment for when, you know, a 10-year-old is going to start using a smartphone in the 5th grade. I feel like that's the age that we should start teaching about what's happening to the data and why they get a certain ad and someone else gets a certain ad, because I think it's that literacy that is the foundation of us challenging power as a public. And it's one of those issues like climate change, like the pandemic, that requires massive distilling of complex science to the public. And I hope that the film plays a small role in that. And then the other thing I hope will happen is as people get more educated, that we'll have citizens and people of democracy engaged, and like Patricia has talked about, I really see this as like the undone work of the civil rights movement, and that the changes that we saw there need to happen here from civil society, sort of educating. And when I look at what happened there, it wasn't sort of enlightened policymakers making change. It was actually people standing up and calling policymakers to do the right thing. And I hope those things will happen. But I really hope that, the scientists, the data scientists on the call realize their power and act on that in the companies that they're in, and in sharing their knowledge with the public in a bigger way.
I must say that of the most productive conversations I've had about this in my work over so many years in this field, I'm really grateful to the Simons Institute and to Shafi for making this not just one, but a whole series of conversations about this issue. And, I think there are a lot of concerned people. I'm thinking of Cynthia Dwork, my friend Cynthia Dwork, who, and Omer, you may recall better than I, there's an organization that she's founded called FAIR, which is precisely about fairness and responsibility in computer science and data. And
I think you're referring to the conference we co-founded, the Fork Foundation of Responsible Computing.
Yes, Fork.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and you were our inaugural speaker.
I just happened to be, yes.
Not by any accident.
Effort. I mean, I was privileged to do that because I think there are so few outlets in this world that really are dealing with this as an ethical problem and providing the kind of ethical hooks to better outcomes. Can I just add one other thing?
Of course.
I'm also really concerned about how we got to this point is precisely, as Shalini says, this lack of mass input and the little I agree buttons that every citizen who is sentient in the developed world presses all the time. I agree. And if you ever print off the terms of service or the privacy terms, they go on for 50 to 60 pages in some instances of selling your soul. And it seems to me that part of the reason, as I said earlier, it's so hard to sue for the downstream effects of harm or disorder or resegregation or reordering of society is that those contracts literally give carte blanche to do anything. That the excavation, the vitiation of what we think of as consent as being a prime attribute of our participation in, in any kind of enterprise, is, you read them. I mean, and not only do you give it away at the time you sign it, you agree that the company has the ability to change the terms of service without your knowledge, and they can update it without your as long as and I think that's a granting of it makes contracts illusory and it makes their power pretty absolute.
We have another legal question. Patricia, you might want to take this one. Algorithms used in decision-making in the criminal justice system recommend preemptively punishing people in the expectation that they will commit a crime. This seems very problematic. What is the legal theory based on which this type of punishment is allowable?
It's not allowable. That's precisely that's the challenge for us. We do not punish people for things that they might do unless it is clearly poses an imminent threat. I mean, that was the question.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's basically what they're asking.
Is somebody, imminently about and reasonably determined, but that determination is a human determination made by judges, there were maybe warrants and so forth involved, as Shalini mentioned earlier. We have due process for determining when we are going to stop somebody injunctively and preemptively. Measure for granting or for determining outcomes in things like child custody, parole board hearings, hiring, and so forth. It is, our metric has always been individual, not assortative. That it is in the present tense, not probabilistically and aligned to the future. So that's the other thing that's happening, is that our entire temporal disorder, our temporal sense of what the law does is being reordered and naturalized in, I think, a very malign sense.
So is that a type mismatch? Is that a sense in which we're using algorithms incorrectly, and how will we use them correctly in that setting? So you're saying they shouldn't be predictive in that setting. It should be left to humans.
I think it's the difference between a doctor looking at your body and deciding what it is that you have, that you have, that you look at the body and the doctor diagnoses you. There's a whole separate valid body of science called epidemiology, in which we look at, contagion, and we look at probabilities for different purposes, for building a public health infrastructure. But we wouldn't take that public health infrastructure and then assign it to my body just because a lot of people can be categorized by a system that we are then not going to interrogate in its specific application. And that's precisely, I think, what has come up in the COVID crisis, that you had algorithms built into triage decisions, and triage decisions have historically, and I think legitimately, been overseen by do not resuscitate orders, by committees with family and with doctors, and everything was so crowded and everything's so overwhelmed that instead you give it to an algorithm, and and then you feed into the algorithm that, for example, the stress of race, category of race, means that you have a pre-existing comorbidity. Just race is considered a pre-existing comorbidity. They're going to pull that plug a little fast, and they're going to say it's not race, it's risk, and that's the harm. How do you? I mean, that's a big problem.
So we have 10 minutes left. I wanted to ask the panel if they have any questions for Shalini, or if there is anything else that you guys want to address.
Well, I have a question for Patricia.
Yeah, let's ask questions.
Patricia, why can't we challenge more of these algorithms under a violation of due process, our due process?
I think we will begin to see that. I think we are beginning to see that. But I think that, part of the problem is just, I think it's a discourse problem and an agency problem. It's the identification of the agentic realities. And so as long as it's a private company and it's a monopoly and somebody's consented to a contract, it takes it out of the conceptual realm of constitutional guarantees of due process, and out of the constitutional meaning of fairness, as opposed to the quantitative definition of fairness, which is a kind of mathematical equivalence, or it's almost like an equation rather than the more complex sense of justice as equity. And so I think that part of it is that we've blinded ourselves to the complications of this. And, I think it may come to a head in some of the discussions of whether or not Donald Trump can come back onto Facebook, and the sudden assertion of the First Amendment in very clear terms. This is a control that absolutely goes against, right or left, ultra conservative or ultra, libertarian. This is a moment in which the governance of, our expressive freedoms is, we are expressing ourselves through this machinery, and I think that like it or not, it's going to be in that field, that even before employment, even before medicine, even before lots of or liberty and due process in the criminal justice system. I think that that's where we're going to have a major constitutional test of this technology.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions anybody else has for the director? Or... No, I have one. Shafi, we have 8 minutes left. So Shafi, if you want to jump in.
Well, I was looking at one of the questions here, which I think had to do with how to give incentives for to help what Seny was talking about, is to incentivize people, let's say in computer science, to look at how to use technology for population where there's not a clear economic benefit. And I was reminded that there was some initiative about climate, trying to tell people that when they get a job offer, that they will tell the company that got them the offer that they would prefer to go to the companies who dedicate more resources toward green energy or something of the sort. So this combines Omer's point that what these companies care about is human resources. The people are not going to take jobs. So maybe it could think some way to incentivize companies to divert funds or to encourage this type of research in order to attract more employees. I mean, I think it's a little bit of idealistic, probably has to be very carefully thought out of how to make that an incentive. So there was one question on that I saw in the chat. And then there was, I think, a question for you, Seny, bringing up, said you brought up a great analogy of a student trying to figure out which level of math course to take. Can you please explain the distortion in that context in more details? By the way, it was interesting that you brought up that example, because there was a whole report about women at MIT that they were saying that one difference was that they were always taking the beginning course. So they all took the same courses in high school. But for some reason, the women wanted to make absolutely sure that they had the right background, but they were actually penalizing themselves, because by taking the early courses, they never got to the chance to take the later courses. Who was really advising this? It wasn't an automatic program. It was their own feelings. I'm not so sure that a program would help one way or the other. Anyway, so that question was to you about the distortion. Can you explain distortion?
It's an instructive case, I think, because the example you gave, Jeffy, is terrific, because you've seen that in other places where if you look at majors in STEM or in economics, I've seen a few places document this now, where if you look at a big difference between men and women in deciding to major, it's that men are much more likely to say, oh, I got a B in the introductory course, I'll go ahead and continue to major. And women are much less like, they feel if they didn't get an A, they shouldn't major in this thing. And that's a big, that turned out to have been a big divide. So I think the sense in which I think of all of these is that, what are they? They're actually an information vacuum. You don't know. I mean, if you just think of how much of your life you find yourself in a situation where you just don't know most of the things you need to know, it's striking. And then you think of it for a first generation college kid, how little they know. And the tragedy to me was that knowledge sits in the data, really, or at least some of the things that could help bridge that knowledge. And to me, I think the distortion is, in other places, we've spent a lot of resources taking what sits in the data and playing it back to people. But here, we simply are not spending that much time in doing that. And I think I might almost just challenge everyone watching, I think, and I think this is what you were getting at, Seny. If you just decide, I have these tools, I'm going to look for these problems that are socially meaningful, that people who are disadvantaged struggle with, that my tools could help. I think even just uncovering these problems and calling them out is already just an enormously valuable thing. Just to say, look, here's a recommender system problem that doesn't look like that, it looks like here. I think even just having that, and to the point of like education, picture how different even just teaching an undergrad CS class would be if you, instead of using the usual recommender system application, you use this one. It kind of opens up students' eyes to, oh, I see, my tool is useful over here. I don't know if that helps. I actually had if we're still asking questions of the director, I had one question for you, Shalini, which is, you surely, now that you've screened it everywhere and you're getting, I'm sure, audience feedback, has there been any feedback that you've been like, or response or experience where you've been like, oh, that surprised me. This is not something I had anticipated going into the making of this film, or even at the end of this?
Tech companies have screened the film, and that was shocking to me because I didn't make the film for them, and I made it for all of us to come to the table. And every major tech company outside of Amazon, because I might have spoken too much about Amazon, has screened the film. And to me, that's a little heartening, because it shows there are people inside of these companies that want to change the system. And I hope it's the beginning of very many films and conversations like this one about ethics and AI.
That's interesting.
Very, very interesting. Perhaps we have time for one more question from the audience before we end, or should we we wrap, Kavita had a question very quickly, if anyone wants to take it. Although one would be inclined to litigate for complete transparency of algorithms, are there cases where one would want to make algorithms transparent to regulators, but not publicly available? And the situation they're thinking of allows for algorithms to be public, but the inequities in the data can be coming from different groups, and this might reinforce existing inequities. So if anybody wants to take that last question.
I mean, that ought to be, yeah, absolutely. This is not an absolute, but yeah. I mean, there are questions of fiduciary relationship.
Absolutely.
Not to turn us inside out so that everything is always known. That's, you know, that's already part of the problem of privacy that we're so concerned about, but yeah.
I think there's a recent case in just in New Jersey. Now it's the land of it's the law of the land that in cases of forensics, the defense attorneys are going to get to look at the internals of the programs, but they're not letting them out publicly. So there's sort of a division between whether it's open source or whether the defense attorney who's under NDA can see it. And that's already a huge leap. A new case. So I want to thank everybody. Wow, this has been fantastic, and especially the director for making such a fantastic film, which really makes it so obvious that we can't just shut our eyes. You know, it's happening, it's out there. There's so many issues and dilemmas that come up, and I've learned a lot during this panel and definitely during watching the movie.
Well, thank you so much to the genius of this panel. It was such an honor to be in conversation with all of you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.